UFOs are everywhere. That's right. UFOs, unidentified file objects, are hiding in files in your cloud apps and storage. UFOs can contain malware that exfiltrates data or deploys ransomware. 70% of UFOs in files can't be detected or prevented by traditional scanning solutions like antivirus and sandboxing. That's where Vatiro comes in. Vatiro prevents UFOs before they hitch a ride in on files in the cloud, without detection and without slowing down business. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Vatiro. That's VOTIRO. The shift to remote and hybrid work over the past 2 years has accelerated application development on cloud infrastructure. However, securing these new assets has lagged behind. Qualys CloudView, the next generation cloud security posture management, delivers an end-to-end multi-cloud security and compliance solution encompassing the entire application lifecycle from build to runtime. CloudView enables enterprises to assess their cloud security and compliance posture, identify risks and gaps, auto-remediate issues, proactively enforce best practices, improve compliance and audits rapidly and efficiently. Identify your most vulnerable cloud assets by visiting securityweekly.com/Qualys. Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Dan Moore about OAuth, the intricacies of tokens, and the gotchas that developers should be aware of when using it. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella and Akira Brand, and it's just about time for the news. But first, follow us on Twitter for live stream reminders, highlighted clips, memes, and more. You can find us at SecWeekly. And Akira and John, one more note about the OAuth dance. I don't know if, I suspect you're David Bowie fans. His birthday was yesterday, and we did mention the OAuth dance. So if anyone out there is working on, coding some OAuth APIs, go grab the Labyrinth soundtrack and dance the magic dance while you're coding. That's my PSA for the day. And we also have lots of news to get through. I'll start off with a breach, just because why not start the year off with people that take your security seriously. This is from CircleCI and is mostly about rotating stored secrets because of a breach. One of the things, an angle I wanted to touch on here that I just thought was kind of interesting is that in the show notes, I posted the announcement from the CircleCI blog, and it's from their CTO. And I went and looked at CircleCI, and they don't have a bug bounty program. If you go to CircleCI their /security page, but they do have some shout out to researchers. And I don't know that this is a causal effect, but I think it's possibly an education here, sort of a learning path on companies as they start to mature programs, perhaps about roles of security, roles of bug bounty programs, in looking at systems. I'm not sure if that's, maybe I'm just overgeneralizing here, but I'm not sure, Akira or John, if that part of this makes sense, or if you're still busy rotating keys because of this breach.
I take this breach seriously, just like we take your security seriously. But seriously, you know what? I think I've probably said this before. Unfortunately, the most interesting part about this to me is when I saw this last week. I think it was last week, right? I'm just like, shrug his shoulders, and I kept going. Mm-hmm. I've become so used to this stuff. But this is sort of usually the type of thing which should get me up in arms. Is like, this is your CI, right? This is like what's actually building your code. It's like if someone's able to get access to that, that's sort of game over in a way. So yeah, I mean that's the gut response for me, but it's yeah.
Yeah, there's only so much. Yeah, Akira,
brighten us up.
Yeah, for sure. That's my job. I guess for me, the first thing that comes to my mind is in a AppSec program, where's the rotating secrets come into the SDLC? Because it seems like something that you'd want to do on a regular basis anyway. So I was curious y'all's input on that.
I'd call it SecOps, not AppSec, but I don't mean that as a dodge to your question. I mean, it's important, right? We talk about rotating keys in prod, but your CI is sort of prod. So who's doing that?
Right.
Yeah, and depending on the size of the company, some companies actually have teams that are responsible for it, like build engineering, to manage this. But I think more to Kira's point, I see that question as a reflection of the maturity in the sense of, can you rotate secrets? can you rotate secrets easily, or how hard is it to rotate secrets? Does that cause, does it take someone an hour to do and a lot of coordination, or is this just a natural point? And are you using a secrets vault, something like, an AWS secrets manager, and do you have good access controls to the secrets? Or are you just rolling your own type of access controls and they're sitting in files in your CI/CD system rather than in memory or an environment variable? So there's a lot of areas there that look like they basically are maturity as the system as your SecOps or your DevOps team, who's probably most responsible for this, are figuring out how best to handle all these secrets, because there's no way you're building a modern web application and not dealing with secrets in one way or the other, regardless of whether it's dealing with API secrets and OAuth 2. But probably once you've built the code, let's take perhaps a walk back into history of web vulnerabilities, even though they're modern day websites. An article from Sam Curry and friends, web hackers versus the auto industry. So we actually hit, I think, a car hacking via web APIs near the end of last year. And here's just another one that's pointing out Mercedes-Benz, Ferrari, Spirion, who's in charge of things like OnStar. And the types of vulns that are here are dead simple. And that's not to take away from the research, because the researchers put in the time and effort. They did some clever things. That the one that I'll highlight real quick is they found that, in the Spirion example, /admin and /dashboard were blocked, but they started fuzzing that, and they found that injecting the %0D, your carriage return character, would basically bypass whatever device was blocking that access, and they got access to admin. And it's just those types of dead simple things that are really cool. And it's fun when they work. And especially, too, there was also a SQL injection there that was just apostrophe after the username and then comment out the rest of that query, and it works. So it's essentially even simpler than the login or 1 = 1 type of attack. So that was the fun thing that stood out to me. Akira, I don't know if you drive a Ferrari or not. We haven't talked about this on our internal Slack channels, but I don't know if there's something that stood out to you on just the web hacking side of getting access to cars or accounts related to cars.
Actually, my first thought when I read this was, serves them right for putting so many features of cars behind paywalls at this point. So that was kind of just something that kind of popped in my mind. I do not drive a Ferrari. I drive a 98 Subaru, which is a good time. It is kind of surprising that these hacks are so straightforward. And I kind of wonder if maybe the cart was a little bit before the horse in releasing these features without the proper security measures. So that's kind of my 2 cents on it. John, what do you think? John's going to disagree.
I don't think the car was before the horse. Obviously it was, but I think you'd need. So here's the fun thing about this. For a lot of these things, I was going to make a joke, but it's actually a serious point. For a lot of these things you're talking about, I just happen to have the Hyundai one on the screen. Remote lock, unlock, engine start, precision locate, flash headlights. All these things are possible. Obviously there's a web interface and all the stuff on the front end, but there has to be some connection to the car, right? So nowadays that's over either 3G or 4G. So anyone who has a car, I'm not sure about your Subaru, but something in that period of time, we've started getting notifications that the 3G networks are being turned off. So that means those cars are going to become secure. And the same now, if you've got a car in 2022 or 23, I think the last one we got has 4G. So that one's going to be good for a few more years, and then that's going to be turned off for 5G. So that's going to go be secure. So the point being, beside the funny haha of just wait long enough, is we've connected to cars like this, and I think to sort of really emphasize what Akira was saying is you can't just have that connectivity back out. And a lot of my sort of friends have been very tinfoil hat on this, to the degree I have one friend who he will pull the OnStore module out of his car, just no interest in that at all. But now he's the one who's going to be laughing and going, "Hey, I told you so." So it's an area we know that the car companies don't take seriously. Sorry guys, but I'm going to say that. Historically and even now, but at the same time they want to hold on to this as much as possible. Well, you've got Apple's coming out with new capabilities for their new version of CarPlay, for folks who haven't seen it, like literally takes over your whole dashboard. But the car companies don't really want to give that access to Apple because they're losing more and more of their ability to control and sell these things, as Akira was saying. So, yeah, if you're going to charge us, get your act together, I guess is the TLDR on it.
Yeah, and I think go listen to our conversation with Dan about OAuth, because some of the aspects where there's an aspect of that federated access, because some of the account takeovers were directly through weaknesses in either the dealerships or in or having access to be able to fix the cars. And so these should be restricted limited access, but were then easily expanded into general impersonation, full account takeover for anyone who's accessing these web apps. So a lot of things to get the act together, as John said. And so let's take let's expand the poor conspiracy tinfoil hat wearing people with Google Smart Speakers. Akira, you had actually pulled on one that was a version of this about the smart home speakers being turned into bugs. And here's one that was $100,000 bounty from a researcher, and it's from the end of December. But I loved it because, hey, congratulations on now being able to afford one of those cars to do some car hacking research. But also, the write-up is wonderful. It touches on a lot of different tools. It touches on intercepting HTTP traffic using the MITM proxy, touches on being able to looking at protobufs, touches on looking at the Chromecast as a similar OS-based device that was easier to inspect, reverse engineer, and that has a similar build to the speakers. And it was also even just touching a little bit onto Wi-Fi security and some Wi-Fi tools. So even if you're not interested in a Google Smart Speakers, I would listeners, you should be interested in the hacking techniques that are walking through here, and a lot of the tools that this researcher is describing about what does an attacker-minded approach to picking apart an IoT device look like. So that was the fun part for me.
I love how this is essentially, it looks like a learning lab, right? So you can actually go ahead and take one of your Google Smart Speakers and hack into it, which is pretty sweet. I know earlier this year, gosh, I think it was about a month ago, I found as Mike said, I found a similar hack where the bug bounty finder found something in Siri where you could essentially listen in via Siri, and this sounds like a very similar experience. So yeah, if you have a Google Smart Speaker, go ahead and hack it.
Go ahead and hack it. And I think one of the things to do is that we like to highlighting this from the educational perspective, but near the very beginning it says you do have to be on the local Wi-Fi network. You do have to have local access. So this isn't the type of vuln that a sky is falling, but it's just clever use and abuse of an application, and it even does touch on some OAuth using the GPS OAuth library. So another good tie-in with our conversation with Dan. But if we're going to get really paranoid, John, can we trust our VS Code extensions?
No, we cannot. And this is sort of an interesting one, I thought. There was an article out, it was actually back to, I can't find my tab, but Aqua Security did the research. There it is. And they sort of they found malicious plugins in the store. So let's back up here a little bit. For those who don't know, if anyone out there doesn't know, VS Code is Microsoft's quote unquote open source free developers IDE for developing. It's actually the number one IDE in the world now. So big. This has been around for what? God, 5 years, maybe, probably closer to 10 now. Very mature platform, all sorts of plugins for it. So those plugins will do anything from allowing you to, add support for C++ or Rust or the language of your choice, or changing what the interface looks like, or allowing you to connect and run your stuff in a cloud, or all sorts, pretty much anything you can think of. VS Code is running in, was it Electron? I think it is. It's basically a JavaScript app on your local machine. So anyways, with that background, Aqua figured out that there's some folks starting to put some of those plugins in there that do things other than are intended, and they're doing things like the standard stuff we see, typo squatting and stuff like that. But what was interesting to me with sort of those two backgrounds is over the last, 6 to 8 months, Microsoft this has been sort of on their mind, maybe not the plugin level, but they have started adding functionality to when you add say like a library to your system. So if you're like, imagine let's pick Go, you're working on an application, you bring in a dependency, and that's now that source tree is in your that source library is in your source tree. So if you go and click down to that directory with VS Code, there's a chance it might find like a dot directory and actually start running something or loading capabilities. So at that level, they've actually, when you add that in now, it will come back and prompt you, do you trust this developer? So they haven't added it yet for plugins, obviously. And I think we can guess that that's going to happen pretty quickly. But one of the examples that Aqua had was talking about, they've got two, like I said, screenshots for a module called Prettier, which is a code formatter. And one has, if you don't look really closely, they look quite the same, but obviously it's, off by a character. And one has 27 million downloads, which is usually what I look for, a number of stars or number of downloads. Sort of, is this something that's being used? We've talked about this in the past. And then the other one has 2,300 downloads. So sort of obvious, one of these things isn't like the other, but still it's yet one more thing we have to look for as developers when we're bringing stuff into our system.
Yeah.
Indeed. I think the only thing I can add to that is that the developer endpoint becomes much more interesting as perhaps the CI/CD pipeline gets hardened. So, attackers will move to where is call it the path of least resistance, or where is the less protected part of your attack surface. So it seems like a natural progression. And as John pointed out, typo squatting is pretty familiar. So we'll just have to keep an eye on seeing how Microsoft updates or hardens VS Code. And Akira, I think you were going to say
they'll do something for this pretty quickly.
Yeah.
This is the type of thing they jump on. But
For sure.
Go ahead.
I just was thinking about the whole aspect of developers kind of being the first line of defense against things like this, right? Against a lot of security vulnerabilities. And this kind of opens up a whole conversation, which I don't think we're going to have time for today. But it's just, how do you keep your devs up to date on this kind of stuff, right? Because they're busy. And they might not necessarily have the bandwidth to be like, oh, dang it, like now I have to worry about VS Code. And so we have to rely on Microsoft. But what if Microsoft doesn't come through? Then what do we do? How do we get our devs to be mindful of this stuff?
I'm going to take the bait, and because I want to tie it into just a quick article I threw in here too, as a reference for stop telling users telling users don't click on that link isn't working. And I think this touches a little bit on that in spirit, is that we don't necessarily need to tell developers you need to start inspecting the number of downloads or the provenance of these plugins, or check for a B versus a P in the URL of this plugin, which is the example John was showing. Because there can be also other mitigating aspects. Do you have any type of, especially in organizations, do you have other security tools on your system looking for either application allow listing, looking for malicious software being installed, looking for DNS calls? Just watching your DNS traffic can be really helpful to look for command and control aspects or remote access tools, which is another theme we may touch on in a second. So I think there are ways that we can still do this. We, speaking as the AppSec team, before putting in on the burden onto developers as our first line of defense. That's where I'd quibble a little bit, saying that they're definitely in line. We're going to shift responsibility, but if we're putting them on the first line of defense, then we as the AppSec industry aren't doing so hot. One of the things I see John smiling, I think I can make you smile a little bit more. We got a chance to talk a little bit about ChatGPT and AI, and you weren't able to join us for that episode, John. But we have a chance to talk about a little bit more because Akira brought one more article about this. So Akira, set us up with this article you have.
Sure. So this is by an author named, I'm not totally sure actually how to say his name. I think it's Swix, Swix, fantastic author. And he goes into Notion AI and makes the assertion that something like prompt takeovers are okay. And he does this by leaking all of the prompts from Notion AI. So essentially what that means is what you do is you write prompts in order to retrieve the source prompts. And he has about he has 7 ways that he does this. But again, the kind of uproar was that, prompt leaks are a big deal. They're going to cause a lot of harm. And he shows essentially throughout this article that they are harmless. which I think is really interesting. And also, if you want to go take a look at the entire prompt leak library, he does link to that on the GitHub. So it's every single prompt that Notion AI would respond to, which is, would format their response with, which is pretty interesting.
Got some ideas here, but I want to make sure to give John the chance because we haven't heard from you on the topic of AI. Assuming you are in fact John Kinsella and not.
I am in fact AI. John Kinsella. Briefly, Swix is super cool. He's a DevRel guy, so you go and check out a lot of his stuff. I think he's local here in Seattle. But you know what this has been on my mind recently is, well, it's everywhere. You can't escape it, right? I think this stuff is super fun. I think where I'm going is sort of looking towards the future. Notion got out ahead of this fairly early compared to what we're going to see, I think, over the next year or two. Microsoft's been in the news again last day or so that they're looking now to add Chat GPT, not just to Bing, but also to Word and the rest of the Office suite. So beside the tracking and all the privacy aspects of which are sort of worrisome to me, it's stuff like this. It's like, I think these things are really great to play with. Definitely, it's the same as pretty much any technology out there. I think people should go and play with it and understand what's possible, as well as looking at articles like this of what's possible when you sort of, scratch your head and go, how can I really play with this? But I think we need to be really careful about how we add technology like this into our applications. And I'll say that from the point of view of thinking like a developer, where very frequently, even over the last 10 years, I've had executives or co-founders come to me and say, oh my God, we need to add like speech recognition or that to our application. And this is a security application. I'm like, what the fuck would I want to add that? But pardon my French. But so it's still sort of, you'll get pressure from those around you saying, hey, we need to add a technology like this. So now you need to be able to sort of think about maybe either use this as an example or go, if you're in the point where you have to start working on this, how do we do it right, or how do we sort of make sure we don't run into things like this? So I think that's really the more important part to me.
Yeah, and I see it a little bit of the example of, I'm going to draw a very rough parallel here to like self-reflected XSS. It's one of those things that the impact tends to be pretty small, except maybe in very specific situations. But as a control, it's something, cross-site scripting is something you still want to address. To me, the prompt injection, yes, it doesn't look like a sky is falling. It's terrible. But if we're positing that, protecting the prompt, or there's a control here to not expose the internal workings, or there is an internal control so that a AI doesn't start spewing racist or sexist or garbage language, enforcing the controls on that are pretty complex because, as prompt injection shows, people can be really clever about getting the AI to work in surprising ways. And if we don't have strong explainability about how the AI is making these decisions, prompt injection is maybe more of a canary in the coal mine. I'm going to search for a much more fun type of metaphor here. But I think that's why, to me, it's something to pay attention to and to be interested in.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go as you start talking through that is, okay, it right now it just might be, being able to do something funny, haha, with it. But it's that, as I refer to, like that finger grip of like, okay, we've got that far. What can we now do with it and go further? So just because that's all we found so far doesn't mean that's all we're going to find. And that's sort of I don't want to say scary, but is a scary part of it, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of the attacks don't get worse, they only get better is a bit of the cliche from the cryptography world as well. So that will be my pithy. That's the most cliche I'll get for in Think PC for this episode, because I want to go and spend some time on a more fun aspect. As listeners know, I often like to dive back into old movies or some new wave post-punk. So some 80s, 90s. Here is Office Space. Literally, someone who had a folder called Office Space Project on their laptop in reference to the wonderful movie that does not get enough credit in the list of great hacking movies. So Office Space from Mike Judge, the creator of Beavis and Butthead as well. essentially, a developer went in and did what is the classic business logic type of insider threat. So these are business logic attacks that the developer was adding to the code base themselves. And we get very few of these. So that's one of the other reasons I did want to highlight this. There's an educational aspect here. But essentially, he was modifying code to double charge customers and then taking half of that charge for himself. What was really fun is that, companies do have auditors, they do some reviews, and they say, there's some discrepancies here. So the developer, noticed that it was being investigated and said, I'm going to modify some code to prevent these discrepancies. And now I'm going to continue this attack. And so it's just wonderful to see this a little bit of cat and mouse game and a great highlight of an insider threat. I think Dan said the attack is coming from inside the house to change what he was saying. So I was just smiling. I was reading through this article.
You know what this reminds me of a tiny bit, like the tiniest bit, is if you've ever seen The Wolf of Wall Street, how they would trade on a blue chip stock and then sell a ton of penny stocks to people. And it was kind of an example of almost like an insider trading scam. And I wonder if software was more widely available back then, what kind of nonsense you would see that would look similar to this in things like Wall Street and trading and things of this nature.
Yeah, go talk to anybody who's worked in the fintech space about how to deal with decimals and dollars and how to round them and how to calculate savings and interest. Lots of gotchas. It's probably maybe second most to trying to figure out what time zone someone is in and how to deal with time. But I don't know, John, if there's any particular office space nostalgia that might come to you from this as well.
For me, I think it's got to be the red stapler. I never did get one. I know they're still out there for sale.
The swing lines.
Yeah. It was a local thing up here, so I heard in the local news, and I didn't expect it to blow up as much as it did as it should have. It's like, oh yeah, it's office space. And yes, arbitrage is a wonderful capability to use for good and bad, but cover your tracks a little better next time.
Indeed.
Listen to Security Weekly and learn how to cover your tracks a little better.
Exactly. Yeah, we'll start throwing in some obfuscation tools in here for our tool segment. Before we do get into the tool segment, let's touch a bit on some power rats and then some Rust. But first, a deep dive, John. You wanted to get some supply chain stuff here.
Yeah, power rats. I like the sound of it. And so this is interesting from a few different points. We keep talking about supply chain. One of these years is going to go away. Sorry, guys, but this is an interesting one. From a few different points of view. Pylium. It's the episode where we can't pronounce things. Sorry, guys. But so their specialty is sort of watching, at least Python, if not some of the other library repos, and look for some of these type of issues. So they did a deep dive blog post on this thing called PowerRat, which is a rat. It's a remote access tool, which would get loaded into your loaded through your consumption of modules from Pippi, from Python. And what was interesting to me is not just so much that, but there's lots of interesting stuff in here. They end up using Cloudflare's tunneling to try and avoid HTTP filtering. There's some running of PowerShell in here. I know PowerShell is becoming more popular, but still it ain't on my boxes. So it's sort of interesting to see that being used as a method of execution after you run pip. So you do a pip install. So for folks who don't know, you pip install, that downloads a package. It looks for setup.py. Then it goes through running in there, whatever it needs to do to set up system, right? This is something that's been around for a while. Sort of the older version of I guess, well, I'd say Dockerfile, but probably shouldn't go there. But the reason I threw this in here was really nice to see walking through the code. And, we talk about what good code looks like and, what proper architecture looks like and how things should look. But this is sort of interesting from a point of view of if you see something like this in an application you're looking at, you might want to sort of go, hey, why is the library I just downloaded running PowerShell? Mm-hmm. So it's good to sort of look at things from that point of view and think about, okay, what's it doing? This is doing what it should be doing. When should my hackles sort of raise and I should be concerned about what I just installed in my system? Yeah,
and I think it's a great tie-in with what Akira mentioned too about the VS Code and what happens on developer desktops.
Yeah, definitely running PowerShell would be a big red flag.
It's funny. It is becoming, I believe, if you look at I don't know, any of the developer surveys from last year, PowerShell is becoming more popular.
Really?
It is quite a nice scripting language. It's still not on obviously, as we're talking, at least in our little bubble, it's not on our systems. But it is growing outside of the Windows sphere, so it's something to keep an eye on.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was fun to see just Microsoft. That was one of the early open source projects that Microsoft released when they made that switch from the 90s era Microsoft of Office Space into the more modern era of actually embracing and using open source. I think Microsoft was the first Linux on the desktop, perhaps even. But before we do on real quick, I had a reference on Rust about a welcome to comprehensive Rust from the Google Android team that had created a course of basically some ways to learn Rust that is perhaps in the early days of the content, meaning that it's very much designed to be a lecture style based. It doesn't have, as they say, some speaker notes. It doesn't have a lot of the Q&A or how to walk through some of the examples and think about, here's an error. What does this error mean? How do you respond to this error? But I wanted to throw that out there as just as some learning tools as well. And John, it seemed to also tie into a Rust article that you hit.
Yeah, so briefly on your one, I have been learning Rust. I won't say comprehensively, but I have been learning Rust over the last month or so over the holidays. And one of the things I like that I'm seeing out there is a pattern of these online books. So the documentation is often quite nice. But we'll tie those two together and talk about documentation. So one of the libraries which you'll use out there, or many people use in the Rust, is a library called Hyper. And its point in life is, you can sort of guess almost from the title, is it does the hypertext stuff for your HTTP. So it'll go out and do gets and fetches and that type of thing for web services, and bring back the result for you to be able to do your crunchy on. But it turns out in their documentation, they say very clearly they've got a function in there which allows you to, I'll say cast, being loose with my words, but allows you to translate the results of a HTTP request body into a array of bytes. And this is a little surprising to me that this I'll call it a weakness. I don't know if they want to call it a bug. We'll call it a weakness. There's a note in their documentation very clearly about this, that it doesn't check the length of the return of that body. So as whatever length that is, it's going to go through it and turn that into a byte array, which means if someone DOSes you with a response that's megabytes or a lot more in size, that you've suddenly got this thing going, expanding and being used in your system. So that could create a DOS, a denial of service. And it turns out there is a way you are able to pass in to look for a content length, or you're able to specify the content length that it should be actually processing. But it looks like almost nobody's using that, even though it's documented, right? So everything should be fixed, but obviously not. Several of the large web frameworks that are using Rust-based frameworks, which are using Hyper, they were susceptible to this. That's been fixed. But yeah, I think it was surprising to me, because this is something to me, it's not quite like a buffer overrun back in our C days where that would end up just writing through memory. So you don't need to check length for that, but still it's resource utilization. And a little surprised that exists, but there we have it.
No, indeed, there we have it. And a good example, too, of there's still, as we move to memory-safe languages, they're still not flaw-free. So those are not synonyms. So a good example there. I want to jump real quick to tools. One of the things that we've been trying to do this year is highlight different tools, small, large, and in between, what's interesting to users. So do please let us know what you'd like to see us highlight, or what you'd like to see us talk about. And Akira, you've got a list, especially that ties in with our CircleCI, perhaps, and the CI/CD
yeah, absolutely.
pipelines.
So Tanya Janka wrote this fantastic shorter article on 7 places to do automated security tests. Part of it is in the pipeline. There's also in the IDE, in the pre-commit hook, at the code repo level, and then outside of the pipeline. You'll notice too, if you read this article, that you'll see several tools and techniques being used over and over. So the first tool that you see over and over would be a SAST tool, an SCA tool, and then like kind of we talked about earlier with rotating these keys. is being very clear on secret scanning, so stopping those security incidents before they happen. So this is a really great resource. You don't have to use every single one of these ideas, but it's a good place to start, especially if you're starting like a new AppSec program, or you're wanting to kind of make your AppSec program a little bit more robust and automate these security testings. This is great. It's just really solid, good ideas.
Yeah, and I throw in maybe, especially for secret scanning, if you're starting from scratch, starting early on, don't really have a budget other than for people, Trufflehawk can be a good tool to go and apply to your to your repos and start looking about for all sorts of secrets that are lurking within there. I took a different direction because we're trying to highlight a bunch of different styles of tools. And this is one that an OWASP project called Amass. And it is a attack surface mapping and external asset discovery. So basically, what do I have? Kind of a sort of approach to asset inventory, and it's written in Go. So if you like to play around with Go, this could be a good project just to play with. But it basically tries to figure out, given an organization, a website, or domain name or IP address space, what's on there. And this is the type of thing that at first I didn't want to be dismissive of, because large organizations have they have vendors, they have tools that do this type of thing, but not everybody's a large organization. A lot of people are coming from the beginning, or they want to learn. And so how do these tools work? And what does attack surface look like? So I thought highlighting this one might be interesting for our listeners. And we have one other thing that we want to start doing is, in addition to tools, is start answering questions from listeners. Now, I didn't have a question queued up quite yet. To spring on our host, but I could make one off the top of my head. But that'll be one of the things that this was an idea from John that really wanted to get some more listener questions in. So John, anything you want to add about this and getting questions from listeners that we could add for a segment?
Yes, I'd like to get questions from our listeners. Excuse me. No, right? We want to make this, and this, I think where it came up into my mind this time is I listen to other podcasts out there, and I think it becomes more interesting to the listener and to the hosts. Is we hear from you guys, like if you have a question around how do we get an AppSec program going, or we tried getting an AppSec program going and we ran into X, or that tool you mentioned is really great, but have you heard about something like that maybe for Rust or for I don't know C# or .NET or something? We got a ton of listeners. We're quite blessed with the number of listeners we have on this show. So there's got to be questions out there. We'd love to hear from you guys. Find us on Twitter or Discord or email or all the different ways. Please reach out, and we're happy to either talk about it on a podcast or one-on-one maybe in some cases.
Yeah, and I think one of the things just to kind of emphasize what you're saying too, we'd love to know, rather than you starting an AppSec program, but what is some of the context you have? Is this your first AppSec program? Or is this with a small organization, an AppSec team of 1, or an AppSec team of 10, or an AppSec team of 100? Because definitely your budgets and your environment can influence a lot of where there's going to be open source or vendor tools or whatnot. So do let us know. And with that, I think it's time to wrap up another start of the year. So thank you, Agara. Thank you, John. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Do please let us know what kind of questions you'd like us to answer, as well as subscribe, hit that like button, check out the show notes. And speaking of CI/CD, check out Assembly Line from Mitch Murder. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.